because here's the mental illness that is still quite obviously in control of some of the minds of people in this country. One great example of that is that Debbie Wasserman Schultz won her seat back again last night in the elections. And it is so disturbing because Debbie Wasserman Schultz is one of these hardcore Marxist criminals who helped steal that DNC nomination from Bernie, and she had to resign in disgrace because of it. So she's actually guilty of crimes, many crimes more than that, by the way. I believe she was probably also involved in the murder or the call for the murder of Seth Rich, the actual DNC email leaker. But the point is these crazy people in Florida give her seat back.
Well, listen, she got reelected, and I think there are 3 others who were reelected who were under investigation by the Justice Department. So that's America for you.
Yeah. Well, I think Q has said it very wisely. Q said, FISA D-class brings down the House. So Adam Schiff, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a bunch of these people may still be on notice. These people are guilty of sedition and treason, many of them. That's the bottom line, John.
Well, Sean, politics is becoming to America what salmonella is to nutrition.
Yeah.
That's all I can tell you.
All right. Well, I want to get back to the Jim Garrison appearance on The Tonight Show in 1968. I've written down some of the things he said right here. I want to share this with folks. I'll put the clip up so you can see him. He had complete control of the interview. The audience was really in his pocket, gripped by every word coming out of the man's mouth. He's very credible. And you've made the point, of course, that it was the deep state and their mainstream media that tried to disparage him, ruin his character, and make him look like a fool. It didn't really work, and you can tell us more about that. But he said on The Tonight Show in 1968 that there were 10 men arrested in Dealey Plaza, several of them connected to the CIA. He then showed some pictures of these men. And Carson asks, who's suppressing all of this info? And Garrison says, I'll tell you who's suppressing it, the federal government. And Carson jumps in and says, who in the federal government? And Garrison says, the administration. The administration of your government is suppressing it because they know that the Central Intelligence Agency, Carson interrupts, on whose order? Garrison says, on the order of the President of the United States. Never have truer words been spoken on The Tonight Show, John.
Yeah, but you missed the great point. And the great point was the audience's applause when Johnny Carson follows that and says, why would he do that? And Jim Garrison says, Johnny, why don't you ask him? And right. The audience erupted in applause. But to me, the most telling thing that he said, and he's looking straight into the camera as I am now, and he says, elements of our Central Intelligence Agency murdered our president. I mean, that is explosive. Now, I'm going to tell you how important that was, because when I originated the AM show, and I had Ronald Reagan on the show, he was a Republican. So then they had what they call the fairness doctrine. I had to have a Democrat on. When I had a Democrat on, I then had to have a socialist on. Then when I had to have a socialist on, I had to have a Nazi on. I had to have anybody on television, equal time in the fairness doctrine, who could get 5% of the vote. And so that's how it was. Now, the 1%, the owners of this country, when they saw Jim Garrison on The Tonight Show, they said, we can't have that kind of truth anymore. And the fairness doctrine was scuttled. Equal time was scuttled. It no longer exists. I'm going to tell you a cute story. The fairness doctrine was so strong, Sean. If somebody reviewed a movie or a book badly, the producer of the movie or the book could then contact the broadcaster and say, I want equal time. It happened in my case. I was the film critic for KNBC for 5 years and Los Angeles Magazine for 10 years. I reviewed a movie called Soylent Green with Charlton Heston. And it was dreadful. And I felt so bad about attacking the film. At the end of the review, I said, well, a lot of good people put good work and time into this. I should say something nice about the movie. Well, the sets are beautiful. But I hated myself for saying that. So then I added, the sets would have been more beautiful if they'd been placed in front of Charlton Heston. Well, so the producer was so outraged, he called NBC and he said, I want equal time. And they said, no. He took it to the California Supreme Court. 2 years later, they said, no. I'm the only person with a review that has been ruled on by the Supreme Court of the United States, because 5 years later, the Supreme Court of the United States, in which Kavanaugh now serves, turned this guy down, saying John Barbour's reviews were of no public importance, so you do not get equal time. But that's how wonderful it was in those days. There could have never been a Sean Hannity or a Bill O'Reilly or Rush Limbaugh, because you were not allowed to pontificate. Because if you did have these Republicans on, then you'd have to have socialists. If you put Bill Buckley on, then you'd have to put Gore Vidal on. All that diversity is gone in America, all because of Jim Garrison's appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And they said, we cannot have this kind of truth upsetting Americans any longer.
Yeah, well, you know what I think so telling about that clip, and people should go to YouTube right now and just type in Garrison. Well, go to John Barbour's World first on YouTube, but otherwise just type in Garrison on Tonight Show and watch it, because it's so telling and it's so clear that Johnny Carson is nervous about this truth that's being told. He knows his job is to run interference to some of it, to try to discredit Garrison and make Garrison look a bit foolish. Of course, Johnny Carson was pretty much a gentleman, but at the same time, you can really see what's going on there. I wanted to ask you this. So President Trump is clearly aligned against the deep state, or should I say the deep state is clearly aligned against the president. We know that the enemies of the people are the enemies of this president. The same people that invented the Russiagate fable are the people who also would like to open the borders and topple our republic. Why did President Trump delay the full release of some of the JFK assassination files until 2021, bowing to national security concerns, according to the Washington Post? Who got to him? Why do you think he's waiting until 2021 on these files?
Because that's when nobody can stop him. They could probably stop him now, but they won't stop him. Then the saddest thing about American politics is that the 1% who own the country select the candidates and leave it to the 99% to elect the candidates over which we have no control. The reason the deep state does not like Donald Trump, because he is not one of them. That's why. All of the others are. I cannot prove this at all, but I think that Bill and Hillary Clinton were CIA when they were in college. I think Barack Obama was probably CIA because his mother was CIA.
Right.
And why is it all these strange deaths happen around the Clintons? Somebody is protecting these people, and that somebody may be the Central Intelligence Agency.
I don't think that's a stretch by any means at all. And I've often said that the Clintons were created by the Bushes. And I always make the distinction here to remind people that it was George Bush Sr. who was once the director of the CIA before becoming president. And the CIA was running drugs through Mena, Arkansas when Bill was governor. And you're right, if you look at that Clinton body count, it's a staggeringly long list of people who were found in the woods with their hands tied behind their back, 2 taps to the back of the head with a gun, and it's ruled a suicide time and time again. So let me ask you this. When we hear Garrison say that 10 men were arrested in Dealey Plaza, we wonder who those men were. We also wonder, why did George Bush Sr. say he can't remember where he was that day? The one person in the world who can't remember where he was when our president was assassinated. Do you think George Bush Sr. was directly involved in some way in the assassination of our president?
It's in the film. A couple of things I want to say about Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison did not lose the Clay Shaw trial. He lost the conspiracy part of the Clay Shaw trial. But what Mr. Garrison was after mostly was the perjury charge, because he had 80 witnesses who knew that Lee Harvey Oswald and Clay Shaw and David Ferrie were all running and seen together. He won that conviction. You never read about that. You don't read about it at all. But the federal government stepped in and stopped that investigation. As for George Bush, the planning for the murder of George Bush, John Kennedy, began on the day of the Bay of Pigs. The reason it began was that the Bay of Pigs was called Operation Zapata. Zapata was the name of George Bush's oil company. 2 of the boats that carried these rebels to the Bay of Pigs were called the Barbour, his wife, and the Houston. Now, you know that the Central Intelligence Agency is not going to give a code name to an operation this big unless somebody very important involved in this operation is working with the CIA, and that person happened to be George Bush. And in the movie, we have photographs of him in Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, 1963. You will be absolutely astonished by the monumental amount of proof and facts. First, about the media. Jim Garrison says on camera, he says, I can't name it, but there were elements of the media before the assassination who were involved in spreading the fiction of this before the truth sank in. In the film, you see that that company is CBS, and that man is Dan Rather, a local street reporter. And here's the biggest murder in the history of the United States. Why is not Walter Cronkite announcing this? This is Uncle Walter, right? Instead, they assigned Dan Rather, and 8 years later, he becomes the anchor man for CBS. At the end of the movie, Jim Garrison said to me on September 5th, 1981, he handed me a list, and he said, John, here's a list of people, including the 10 bums there that were arrested in Dealey Plaza, and a bunch of others. And he said they should all be arrested and questioned in regard to the murder of John Kennedy. Well, a lot of them have died, but a lot of them are still alive. And the movie ends, we put together a wanted poster. And the wanted poster has Dan Rather, who was first to lie to us about the direction of the head went when the shot hit him. He said it hits him in the back of the head, and he moves violently forward. Now, America believed that because we believed our media, and we didn't know it until 1975 when Geraldo Rivera put the Zapruder film on television late night with Dick Gregory. And there was such a furor knowing that we were lied to that they set up the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The movie shows Richard Sprague, a tough Philadelphia attorney who's taken on the mob and the government and gotten convictions. He says, we are going to solve this crime and the murder of Martin Luther King because we are not hiring any CIA agents or FBI agents to help us with the investigation. He had a staff of 6, not one with CIA or FBI. And guess what? The CIA assets in the media and in Congress and in the Senate moved to get rid of Richard Sprague. We found the video of Richard Sprague saying that, and it is in the film. And he explains how he was sabotaged and replaced with G. Robert Blakey, that hack who blamed it on the Italians, blamed it on the mafia. And you and I know that if the mafia had murdered the President of the United States, there would not be one pizza parlor in America. The mafia is not in a position to shut down an investigation into that murder or to shut down the media. Only the government is capable of that. And that's what the government did, and that's what the media did. So in the wanted poster, we have Dan Rather, we have LBJ's press secretary, became very popular. You know who I'm talking about? I'll remember his name. He's very famous liberal, been on PBS a lot. He is from the South. He's the one that ordered the bubble top removed from the limousine on a rainy morning. Then the other is Barack Obama, because when he was president of the United States, after Congress had said that on a certain date these files must release, he should have signed an executive order ordering those files to be released. And we delivered that wanted poster at the very end of the movie to the Justice Department, where it is still an open, cold case.
Right. Wonderful job, John. And I want to ask you this here, too, or I want to make this point. Not only could the Italian mafia not coordinate the assassination and pull this off, they couldn't get the mainstream Mockingbird media to parrot the official story over and over and over and over again that it was a lone gunman. And that's exactly what these Mockingbirds did, because they are CIA media. And you can comment on that in a second, but before I forget,
Yes.
you mentioned the picture of what appears to be George Bush Sr. at Dealey Plaza that day. I've seen those pictures. They're very fuzzy. It definitely resembles him. Is there any concrete proof that he was there? And before you answer, have you seen the clip of this demon, the former head of the CIA, George Bush Sr., at Gerald Ford's funeral, talking about the lone gunman and smirking?
After a deluded gunman assassinated President Kennedy,
there was a very real moment that I think that's one of those things, that's a tell. What do they call it? Like a Freudian slip.
Yes.
Body language slip at that funeral where he literally smirked when he mentioned the lone gunman.
What about McCain? He called it an intervention by accident. John McCain called it an intervention. But to show you how smart Jim Garrison was, first of all, Jim Garrison believed the Warren Report. Jim Garrison's a former FBI agent. He was in the military. He was at Dachau in Germany when it was liberated. The one photograph he had in his office, in his house, Sean, is him sitting on the fence, the Barbour behind him, and we wrote underneath, "Lest we ever forget." And it was only an accidental meeting with Hale Boggs, the only dissenter of the Warren Report, on a plane. And Hale Boggs said, "That kid could have never pulled that shooting off with that old Manuel Carcano, Jim. I mean, I'm a hunter and I know." So Garrison said, "You mean?" And that's right, I mean. Now, Hale Boggs died 2 years later. He went before Congress and he said, "The FBI and the CIA have lied to us about the murder of John Kennedy. He died in a plane crash over Alaska. And guess who drove him to the airport? Bill Clinton. He was the driver that drove Hale Boggs to the airport." So what Garrison did, he got 3 sets of the 26 volumes of the Warren Report. He had a set in the car, a set in the office, a set at home, and he absolutely memorized it. When I sat down to talk to him, I said, "Mr. Garrison," and I'll tell you something, Sean, sometimes, aside from all the factual material he gave me the death certificate. Signed by Dr. McClellan, shows it's a gunshot wound to the right temple. You can't find that death certificate in the Warren Report. You can't find it anywhere. Garrison had it. So to show you, in spite of all these facts, sometimes somebody says something to you that rings this bell of truth. And I said to Mr. Garrison, you were with the FBI, you were in the military, you're independent, you're not aligned to any political party. Whatever made you think you could take on the government of the United States? And without missing a beat, Sean, he said, "John, I guess as a kid, I saw one too many Frank Capra movies." And he said, "I think I made the mistake of thinking I was living in the country I was born in." And that was in 1981 when he said that. He said, "America's becoming like a fascist state." And indeed, it has become like a fascist state. And Trump is trying to do something about that. And that, I love that line from All About Eve with Betty Davis. She says, "Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride." I think the next 2 years, Sean, are going to be a very bumpy ride. But Red Fox said to me when we were talking about Jim Garrison, and I said, what a hero he was, because all of these things happened by accident. My meeting Mr. Garrison happened by accident. His bumping into Hale Boggs happened by accident. And Red Fox said to me when I said that Jim Garrison was a hero, he said, "John, heroes ain't born, they're cornered." Yeah. And Jim Garrison was cornered by learning the truth about what the Central Intelligence Agency did to John Kennedy, who was our only peace president. You can't even find anyone in America now talking about peace on any level. They don't exist anymore. Yeah. You know, there was a women's march on the Pentagon 3 weeks ago that went totally unreported, both on the internet and mainstream media. quite a substantial march. I know women who marched in it. No cover.
Yep. Well, look, I wanted to ask you this, though. Let's circle back to George Bush Sr. My question to you was, is there any proof, you cited the photos, is there any hardcore proof to suggest he was in Dealey Plaza that day? I believe he probably was. Again, he says he can't remember where he was that day. And then he smirks at the Ford funeral about the lone gunman theory. Do you think he was there? Do you have proof that he was there?
Well, I can't say definitely there's proof. It's a question, is this George Bush? A lot of people claim it's proof because it does look like George Bush. There are comparison photos taken of him in the CIA office and in Dealey Plaza, and they're overlapped and they match. That's as much proof as there is. But let me tell you something. And I didn't put this in the film. They plotted the murder of John Kennedy when he called off the air support for the Bay of Pigs. An intelligence agent who was second in charge of intelligence in Vietnam, whose son was a cameraman on my first movie, called me to a private meeting. And he told me before the Bay of Pigs, every intelligence agency in America was in Miami in a big conference room with this massive map of Havana. And they were all selecting the offices that they would hold, Naval Intelligence, CIA, FBI, the offices they would have in Havana once the Castro was thrown out. Then the word came that Kennedy had called off the air support. And he said there wasn't one guy in that room that didn't call that man a son of a bitch, or worse. And that's when Garrison said the planning started. And the least important person in the Kennedy assassination is Lee Harvey Oswald, because Garrison proved in '67 he never even fired the gun. And they had 2 or 3 other patsies lined up in case it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. And Dick Russell writes about one in a great book called The Man Who Knew Too Much. Wonderful book. And this guy, who was assigned to follow and watch Lee Harvey Oswald, when he wrote back to his supervisors about what he was seeing with Oswald, he got no responses. And he thought, his name was Nagel, Richard Case Nagel. He thought he was going to be the patsy if it wasn't Oswald. You may know the story. He went to El Paso, Texas in September, and he walked into a bank, pulled out his revolver, and shot into the roof. And when the cops showed up, he said, "I want to be in jail on November 22nd. I don't want to be in Dallas." And he was sentenced to an insane asylum by the federal government. Jim Garrison gave me all his information. Allen Dulles was then appointed. He was fired by Garrison, along with Cabell, his assistant, whose brother was the mayor of Dallas, who helped change the route of the limousine. It was supposed to go down Main Street, and they changed it against all of these Secret Service regulations to go slow down to 11 miles an hour in front of the book depository. But he was appointed, Allen Dulles, as the head of the Warren Commission. And there was not any outrage. But you remember after 9/11, George Bush wanted to appoint Kissinger as head of the investigation into 9/11. Of course, an investigation that never happened. And there was no word from the mainstream media about this man who'd been called a war criminal for his participation in the planned murder of democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende in Chile. But those who spoke up were the families of the victims. They were screaming on the streets, so they had to remove Henry Kissinger. No such furor went up over Allen Dulles being appointed head of this. Now, he is a hireling. He is, as head of the CIA and the Warren Commission, he's a hireling. Somebody in the 1% of the old families that own the country ordered the murder of John Kennedy. This is not in the film. This is only, and I'm only saying this publicly for the very first time because Jim Garrison told me all this in confidence He said, I have no proof of this, John, so don't put it in the film, but it's only speculation on my part. He thinks the person that ordered, okay, do you remember the movie Executive Action?
Yes.
Okay, there is a high up politician saying we should do this. This is the one they're all talking to, the CIA and the FBI, and this politician says it. He said it was probably Averell Harriman. Averell Harriman was a staunch enemy, even though he was part of the JFK Advisory Committee. He hated John Kennedy and his opposition to the war in Vietnam. This is on the record. 2.5 weeks before the murder of John Kennedy, Averell Harriman, behind Kennedy's back, sent a memo to the CIA authorizing them to get rid of DM in Vietnam. And they did. They assassinated him, and 2.5 weeks later, they assassinated John Kennedy. Now, that's only speculation on Mr. Garrison's part, but I'll tell you how smart he is. When he arrested Clay Shaw, and he had to because he had David Ferrie already confessed that he was CIA, and he died a mysterious death. They said it was suicide, and he left 2 different suicide notes. But when Garrison arrested Clay Shaw, he researched the origins of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he said the first fake war was a Cold War. He said the Russians lost 25 million people. They were no threat to us at all, militarily. And so what they did, they create the CIA, but the articles creating the CIA were not set up by a military man. They were set up by a Wall Street lawyer, James Forsyth, who began to question Harry Truman's foreign policy. And of course, they committed him to a mental ward at Bethesda. This is also in the film. And he jumped out of the 26th floor, supposedly another suicide. But that's how smart Garrison is. And he said they set up Project Mockingbird. They had already, people don't know that in 1953, Iran had a democratically elected president named Mossadegh, a professor. And what he did is he nationalized British Petroleum. He said, hey, we're only getting 10% of our own oil. Tears up the contract, and they said, we want a new contract. We want half. Eisenhower told Dulles, hey, he's setting a bad example. Get rid of them. So the CIA murdered him. And the CIA does this all around the world. Latin America is filled with these interventions. So what they did, Mark Twain even commented about the Philippines, for crying out loud. Another fake war. Garrison called the Cold War the first fake war. But he said the obvious one was Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And now, of course, you had the biggest and the worst recently was George Bush's invasion of Iraq, when the CIA proved there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And Susan Lindauer, the CIA agent who couldn't get an audience with George Bush, went to her congressperson and said, I have the documents and the proof. There are no weapons over there. We should not invade. They arrested her and put her in prison for a year without a trial.
Right.
That's how bad the deep state is.
Right. Well, I'm going to bring this full circle, because for anybody who wonders why we're having a conversation about the assassination of JFK 55 years later and how is it pertinent at this point, I'm going to explain to you, I'm going to quantify for you guys in real time in today's news exactly how it is still pertinent. This deep state infrastructure that we've just outlined for you is still, unfortunately, alive and well. And before I get there, I just want to say, you mentioned Harriman as possibly ordering this thing. You'll note, folks, that it always comes back to these international bankers. And on the Warren Commission, one of the people on the Warren Commission was John J. McCloy, the former president of the World Bank. The deck was stacked, and the deck is always stacked against the people by these bankers, John.
Yeah, that is such a wonder. I wanted to applaud you on the air right now, because that's in the film. Because one of the important things about this was that John Kennedy was opposed to the Federal Reserve, but he didn't come out and say it publicly. Well, and he was also opposed to John J. McCloy. What he did, he signed an executive order 11110 which called for the printing of silver notes by the Treasury of the United States. At that time, interest rates from the Federal Reserve, like 21 or 22%. If you borrowed these silver notes from the federal government, you would only have to pay back like 0.5%. This meant if these silver notes continued to be published, the Federal Reserve, which is a private banking cartel owned by 6 private families, they would have been out of business. But when John Kennedy was shot at high noon in Dallas, the presses that printed that money stopped printing. Now, Executive Order 11110 is still in existence. Nobody has implemented it yet. But I would not be surprised when Donald Trump becomes president again in 2020, if not only does he reverse the Communications Act and call it a monopoly and put the media back into the public hands, I would not be surprised if he began printing those silver notes that John Kennedy printed in 1963. That is a wonderful point you brought up.
Well, that's a wonderful point you just brought up, because you know he has spoken out against the Fed and its policies of raising rates too fast at this point. They kept them close to zero or at zero forever for Obama, for his benefit, for that Marxist president's benefit. And now they're raising rates, and Trump speaks out, and they punish him for it by trying to tank the stock market. They want to remind him who still has all the power, but I think he needs to neuter the Federal Reserve. He needs to disband the Federal Reserve, and I hope you're right. I hope that prediction is right. Now, we're going to bring this whole thing full circle here. Are you ready for this, John? Honestly, this is truly incredible. So let's just back up, and let's remember Garrison on Carson. And Carson says, who's suppressing all of this info? And Garrison says, I'll tell you who's suppressing it, the federal government. Carson, who in the federal government? Garrison, the administration. The administration of your government is suppressing it because they know that the Central Intelligence Agency, Carson interrupts, on whose order? Garrison, on the order of the President of the United States. Here's where I get goosebumps. Are you ready for this? That's Lyndon B. Johnson. We started this conversation talking about CNN, the CIA, and fake news and the deep state, right? Get this. I just typed in Lyndon B. Johnson, and the first return from Google, John, is this from CNN. Dated yesterday, Tuesday, November 6th. The headline is this: Lyndon B. Johnson warned us about this. And it shows Trump. And I'll scroll down. Let me just read this. CNN, 52 years ago, President Lyndon Johnson warned the nation not to be seduced by proponents of white backlash. Less than 48 hours before the 1966 midterms, just like today, LBJ saw the electorate a noxious mix of white anger, hatred, and resentment. You can't make this up, John. These people over at CNN will do nothing but spread lies, and it's shocking to me to see the headline, Lyndon B. Johnson here, as you and I are having this conversation. Was Lyndon B. Johnson involved in the planning of the assassination of JFK, in your opinion? Because he was most certainly involved in the cover-up.
No, I asked Mr. Garrison that, and he said there's no question that, he says, this is his quote, that LBJ probably knew it was going to happen, and when he ducked, he was thinking about how he was going to redecorate the Oval Office. That's an exact quote from Jim Garrison. Lyndon Johnson, again, was another hireling. The president, one of the questions I asked Mr. Garrison was, do you think the president of the United States runs the country? And he said, John, I used to think so until they murdered John Kennedy. And until they get to the bottom of the murderers of John Kennedy and bring them to justice, no president, future president, will ever run this country. They are run by something else. And I think that's what's happening with Donald Trump, because remember when you know why I said Donald? I saw this interesting interview with him, and he said, my close friends don't even call me Donald anymore. He keep calling me president. I said, please call me Donald. He said, the first thing that happened when I became president is a guy from the CIA shows up in the White House, a guy from the FBI, and they're telling me the Russians are involved. And you know what the expression that he used was? And he said it on the air. He said, I think they were shaking me down about something. And you know what? It almost was like a warning to him that they were going to prove somehow the Russians were involved in the election. And my observation about that was, you know what? If Russia was involved with America's elections, which I don't think happened, but if they were, it was with a computer. But look what we do all around the world. We don't use a computer, we use assassinations. We use bombs, we use guns when we interfere with other people's governments, and we do it all the time. And look at, I hate to say this, but it's true. The two most corrupt parties are the Republicans and the Democrats, proven in the past. A corrupt Republican administration in Florida and a non-constitutionally observing Supreme Court gave the presidency to George Bush. And in Chicago, the corrupt Democratic machine of Mayor Daley gave that Democratic nomination, I hate to say, to John Kennedy. But the difference between John Kennedy and George Bush is that John Kennedy realized the corruption and the nature of what he was up against, because Eisenhower had warned us about the power of the military-industrial complex. Now, here was a popular general, a very popular president who could have done something, but he didn't. He ran from office and he left it in the hands of a 42-year-old young man, which was really sad. And you know, if you go to American University, where I screened the film, by the way, standing room only, a great ovation, and you Google President John F. Kennedy's peace speech at American University, you will hear the greatest American speech ever since Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
Well, we'll check that out. And you mentioned Trump talking about the CIA or FBI or whoever came to speak with him. It reminds me of Jesse Ventura when he won that surprise victory to become the governor of Minnesota. He tells the story about how, I think on his first or second day, he was ushered down into a room below the state capitol where he was surrounded by CIA agents who he says look just like everybody from, you know, any walk of life, men, women, different ages. Most of them would not identify themselves with their full names, and they wanted to know how he won. They were so surprised. And he said, first, before I answer any of your questions, I want each and every one of you to introduce yourselves to me. I want to know who you are. And half of them would not identify themselves by name.
You know, John, I'm telling you, I could applaud you again. You're a treasure. You know, I call this serendipity, because for 11 years, I tried to book Jesse onto my little internet show. And when the film came out, he called me and asked me for copies of the film. And I said, Governor, I never called him Mr. Ventura, Jesse said, Governor, you know, for 11 years, I've been trying to get you to come on my show because I want to ask you one simple question. And he says, what's the question? I said, you come on the show and I'll ask you. So he said, book me. So we booked him for an hour. The very first question I asked him was that. I said, when you became this radical who was independent and became governor of Minnesota, the first thing that you had to do is sit down with a dozen CIA agents. Did you film them? Did you record their names or whatever? And he told me about the story that you just told me. And an interesting thing about Jesse, when he left the governorship, he was the most popular man in America. And two networks, CNN and MSNBC, began bidding to get his services, and MSNBC won. And the very first show that he wanted to do was about the Warren Report. And they called him into the office, and they had a document that he had to sign. And they said, we here at NBC support the conclusions of the Warren Report. And in order for you to be here, you have to sign this document. He said, I'm not signing it. They fired him on the spot. He went to Mexico. He used the income, he said, to build this huge home in Mexico where he goes to spend the Minnesota winters. And he could not do any show for 3 years. And look where he is now. He should be on the air in America. Instead, he's on the air in the Soviet Union. It's Russian television. And that's where you see Jesse Ventura today. That's why President Trump, when he gets the presidency in 2020, he's going to reverse the Communications Act so people like you can be on national television with your own station or network, and Jesse Ventura can come back home to the United States where he deserves to be.
What a great story. Well, John, I can't tell you how much I've appreciated your time today and having you on. And I want to remind people that the correct name of your film is The American Media and the Second Assassination of John F. Kennedy. And tell people where they can find that.
It's on iTunes. If you just Google John Barbour, it'll come up on iTunes. It's a runaway hit on Amazon, The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and on Vimeo. Or you can go to, as Sean said, YouTube.com/JohnBarbersWorld.com. You'll find it there. And it's only $2 on Amazon. So I'm not making any money. I've spent 48 years trying to tell Mr. Garrett's story, and I've spent about $10,000 a year trying to tell that story. And for me, it's repaying the country that left this. I was sort of like, I came from a severely dysfunctional family in Canada, and I was 15 years of age, ran away to the United States, where I was later deported a couple of times. So it is my thank you to this unbelievable country, the only country in the world made up of every other country in the world, and the only country in the world that was built on a catalog of laws called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. No other country in the world can say that or boast that. So that's my gift.
Amen. Well, you are an American treasure, John. And again, thank you so much for your time. I very much appreciate it.
Oh, Sean, it was an absolute delight, and I hope we get to do this again sometime.
Yeah, me too. And I really, really want to thank you for all you do and for your truth telling, because as Q has said, where we go one, we go all. And I think one of the most inspiring things about President Trump has been that he actually is a unifier, bringing people together from different races, different creeds. Across the aisles, people are coming together, and people are beginning to walk away from the leftist Soros party in droves, and that's the best possible news. Our guest has been John Barbour. You can find him on YouTube at John Barbour's World, and do search for the movie on Amazon, The American Media and the Second Assassination of John F. Kennedy. All right, John, until next time, God bless.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you, sir.